Now we're live.
Very good, thank you. Okay, we'll begin the Housing Committee meeting of Akron City Council. I'll ask Sarah to give us a roll call.
Lesko.
Aye.
Gursky. Samples.
Aye.
McKittrick.
Aye.
Connor.
Aye.
All committee members are present except for Swirsky.
Thank you, Ms. Viviano. Thank you. At this point, I'd like to recommend that we accept the minutes of the previously held meeting. Is there a motion on that?
Motion to approve previous minutes.
Thanks. Second?
Second.
Thank you. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, didn't hear any opposition, so therefore we'll assume those are approved. Very good. We do have two items that are actually substitutes that are offered as an amendment. The first one is number 2. Ms. Viviano, would you like to read those in? Thank you.
Item number 2, substitute offered as an amendment. This is offered by Mayor Horrigan and President Somerville. Ordinance amending and or supplementing Title 15 Land Usage, Chapter 150 Environmental Health Housing Code to add sections 150.51 and 150.52 to create legal defenses in an eviction matter for tenants who attempt to tender all past due rental payments to a landlord and capping the amount of reasonable late fees that a landlord may impose on a tenant and declaring an emergency.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Viviano. On this first item here, is there someone here that wishes to possibly speak about this one, about the changes?
Hi, Mr. Chairman. This is Ellen Nisht with the Mayor's Office. I'm happy to briefly explain that. So this is a substitute, and the only change that is different from the original piece that was presented to this council was the amount of late fees. That reasonable cap was set at 5%, $25 or 5% of the monthly rent. And we've adjusted that to up to 8% of the monthly rent based on some feedback that we got from members of council. That's the only change in that first piece.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you. Is there any questions or comments relative to that proposal at this point? I believe, Ms. Ellen, there is no desire to vote on this today. Referring is okay.
Yes, my understanding, and I'll defer to President Somerville as she's a co-sponsor of this amendment, but my understanding is the request is now that council look at this change and plan to vote on it next week. But
very good. Thank you. Thank you. Any comments, President Somerville?
No, thank you so much, Mr. Chair. Again, just asking council members to review the change. Let us know if you have any additional questions, and we will be asking for a vote on next week.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions or comments? If there is none, nothing. Oh, okay, Mr. Lombardo and Mr. Lombardo first.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just thought it was important to read into the record that, this, like section D says, so section 150.51, section D talks about that this section in no way limits the ability of a landlord to initiate an eviction action for reasons other than solely for non-payment of rent. So, the landlord or housing provider has some other issues with tenant, then, certainly that is their choice to, pursue it. So we're just talking about here the, the legal defense as far as, pay to stay here. So I just wanted to make that clear. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Malik and then Ms. Amobian.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that, we've heard concerns from housing providers over the last month about this piece, primarily regarding the late fee amount. And so I think this amendment, while I was fine with 5%, I think the amendment shows that, we are listening to people. And, I think the only other concern that I had heard on this piece was a concern that sometimes landlords will use non-payment of rent as a pretext to evict a tenant who they think is violating the lease in other ways, whether it's criminal activity, other things. And I think that that's not a good argument, right? I mean, if someone is violating your lease because there's criminal activity, other things, then you can bring a action for that. And this won't apply, just as Councilman Lombardo just said. But if there's someone who's bringing a eviction action for non-payment of rent, and the person shows up and puts into escrow with the court the money, late fees, and court costs, we should take it as a matter of fairness. So I hope we can all approve this next week, and I'd like to be added as co-sponsor if that's agreeable.
Thank you. Ms. Amobian?
My request is that if I can have someone identified that I can call, or they can call me, and we can kind of walk through both of these pieces. I just have some questions, but I want to walk through.
Okay. Yeah, I do know we have some guests here today that will be providing us some expert testimony. So we will go through that, and then I will make that request to the president to make sure someone reaches out to Representative Mobian.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Freeman?
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have video here. I had something posed to me this week, and I said, I don't know, I will ask. Basically was a startup landlord, and he is dependent upon the payment from the individual that is renting his property. And he said if he goes 3 or 4 months without a payment, good chance he would go into the bank would take action. I just think that's a scenario we need, might need to think through. And if he's in legal action with his bank and somebody shows up with a payment, it's kind of a moot point at that point, because the owner of the property has already entered into a foreclosure position because he could not, he couldn't rent the property out. He's in a foreclosure position. I just know we heard from a lot of landlords, I believe last week, that have multiple properties, 10, 15, 20 properties. Not all landlords are that way. So I don't know what the scenario would be. Would that landlord be in any kind of legal position? So he can't take the money because he's losing the property because he didn't get payment. So it's just a kind of a funny little scenario that I think maybe would deserve some think through. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. That might be relative to the next one. I'm not certain. Ellen, would you like to answer this, or President Somerville? Or do we want to get back to Mr. Freeman? I'll counsel on that question.
I guess I would have, so the scenario is that the tenant wasn't paying rent for some period of time, which caused the property then to go into foreclosure. I would say it would be that landlord's responsibility, as soon as the rent was not being paid, take action, to either seek an eviction based on that. This only deals with if the tenant then comes up with all the money. So I'm not sure of any scenario where foreclosure would already have taken place in that short of a time frame. So maybe I'm misunderstanding the scenario, but I think that, again, landlords still have the right to evict a tenant who's not paying rent. This is for a tenant who comes up with the rent and pays the full amount plus late fees. So again, if that landlord's already in foreclosure, they must have waited a very, very long time to seek that eviction, if I'm understanding your scenario. But if there's more details to it, I'm happy to also talk. I'm sure someone else on this call also would be happy to talk to that scenario with you as well.
Yeah, and it may just be the situation where it's incumbent upon the property owner to let his tenant know, hey, you're not dealing with somebody that's flush with cash here. Your payment each month helps me make the mortgage payment on this piece of property.
Right, and then it would be that landlord's responsibility, if they're not getting that payment, to take swift action, under their lease, because obviously they don't have a lot of leeway. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Next, I see Mr. Neal.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. To Mr. Freeman's point, I think it depends on how the landlord has secured the property. A lot of investors may not be using traditional financing. They may be using hard money loans or private funding, and all those terms are independent of one another. So what I'd like to see, the good thing that's come from this is that we have had received a lot of contact from landlords. And what I would ask, I'm still one, I think we're in a good position to create some form of landlord tenant council. So in regards to this, I would just ask that, I know you've been contacted by a lot of them, that, we let them vet it. We pick some, let them vet it. There's never going to be a perfect scenario, but I do know it's, real estate is a very creative industry. And you can't think, I don't know how many people on here own real estate or have done any kind of financing for property outside of a traditional bank loan. If you haven't, then you don't know the different challenges that a landlord could run into. It may not be the traditional financing with a bank where you get so much time before your loan goes into default. So that's why I'm saying, I appreciate what we're trying to do, but I just hope we use the resource that's available to us. The different, I know we had the professional realtors, we had the professional real estate investors. Let them work so we can put a good piece of legislation together. But what I don't want to do is just assume that everybody's financing their properties the same way with the same terms. With that being said, there's never going to be anything that's perfect. So I appreciate the time we've taken and the things that we're bringing in. I just ask that we use the resource we have and shape the legislation. And that may have been the case, but just make sure that we're working with the landlords, because I know I, like many of you, have gotten all kind of emails, just stressing their concerns. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Ms. Segovia, I see your hands up. I think.
I don't think I lowered it.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Very good. I would like, we do have some new guests coming in, some new guests and some guests who've been here previously on this, but on this here piece, I'd like to entertain a motion so we can get to the next one, that we refer this item. So can I hear a recommendation to refer the substitute offered as an amendment known as item number 2?
Motion to refer.
Thank you, Ms. Samples. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. McKittrick. All those in favor of referring this item number 2 on the new legislation, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Against? Very good. The ayes have it. Next, we have item number 3, and I'll ask Ms. Viviano to please read in this particular item as well, a substitute as well.
This is the substitute offered as amendment offered by Mayor Horrigan and President Somerville. Ordinance amending and or supplementing Title III, Chapter 38, Unlawful Discrimination, Section 38.01, Definitions of the Code of Ordinances of the City of Akron to prohibit discrimination on the basis of lawful source of income and declaring an emergency.
Thank you, Ms. Viviano. Ellen, do you have a report on this one too?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this piece is essentially just kind of cleaning up the legal language in the initially submitted ordinance around source of income protections. So as initially drafted, source of income was added as a protected class under the city's existing non-discrimination ordinance. Although all the whereases and all the discussion has been around housing, it was kind of pointed out to us that this could have been applied to other arenas, and that was not the intent of the piece. So we've clarified that in this amendment to say that when we're talking about discrimination based on source of income, we're specifically talking about in housing transactions. So it's not a substantive change in that way. It's just clarifying what was the original intent.
Thank you for that report. Any questions or comments reference this particular item? Okay, not hearing any. I understand also with this particular one too, we'd also like to refer this item. So I would like to entertain a motion that we refer item number 3 under the new list of legislation.
Motion to refer. Second.
Thank you. All those in favor of referring this item signify by saying aye.
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 Against? Very good. The ayes have it. Thank you all. We do have, as mentioned, some folks here who've been with us before and some new ones. So out of respect, I'm going to try to do this, whereas the new ones, we'll give them an opportunity to speak first, if that's okay with everyone, and then go from there. So not unless there was some other order I have not heard. So with that, I'll ask Mr. Scalise. I believe you're newer to the committee. So please introduce yourself and thank you for joining us here this afternoon.
Well, thank you for having me, Chairperson Fusco, and hello to all the members. First of all, I need to apologize. I'm having camera problems. I hope you understand this is not some hypnotic attempt with the mesmerizing camera to convince you what I'm here to talk about. So I'll make this brief. I'm here today on behalf of United Way of Summit Medina to advocate for this source of income protection, primarily on behalf of the clients that we serve. Our work falls primarily in the realm of returning people to housing from either shelter or a homelessness situation. As you guys are all aware, homelessness is still an issue that we're combating within the city. And having landlords that we work with are vital to us, and we rely on our landlords to be able to help us rehouse people into stable housing. So I thought it might be best real quick just to sort of give you a snapshot as to why we believe it's so important for us. Since the first of this year, in my rapid rehousing program, which is rental assistance and case management to get somebody stable in a private market apartment, we've done 102 intakes for people that are either living outside or staying in a shelter that need help and assistance in returning to a housed environment. And so out of those 102 intakes that we've done, as of April 30th, we've been able to house 11 people. The flip side of that is I have 91 people out there in the community right now who have full financial backing behind them to have the rent paid to secure a unit that are struggling to locate units in our market. Given the competition out there, what we're basically asking is an opportunity for those folks most in need who are going to utilize this assistance to at least have a shot on the playing field. Currently, as I said, 91 people out there. Out of the 11 people that I've housed, they averaged 8 turndowns when they made applications for rent. And those could be turndowns just generally, your landlord says, I don't work with these type of programs. Could be turndowns based on their background. We hold no naivety that we serve a population that has things in background and credit history that come to light, but those things would not be preempted by passing this income or the source of income protection. What we know is that in communities that have done this, there's generally a 12% rise in utilization rates for assistance programs. And so what that means really for me is 10 more people return to housing for being homeless. And so that's really important for us as an agency that's trying to serve homeless folks in our community and work with other partners. We believe that this is vital legislation to at least even the playing field for our consumers. And so the other flip side of that is we want to work with landlords. I think that this is a community that responds to landlord needs, and certainly the discussion around this has been healthy for everybody to learn, is to figure out ways that we can make it easier and a more conducive environment for landlords, for us. But we know when a landlord turns us down for assistance protection, it's just a consumer that doesn't get an opportunity to make their case. Whether that's on an application or a face-to-face meeting, there's no opportunity to develop that relationship that might lead to housing stability and a chance to live on their own, self-sufficient again. And so United Way of Summit Medina, we understand that there's a vital need to develop collaboration with landlords, to work with them, to try to maybe look at system-wide things we can do to make evictions a more efficient process for both tenants and landlords, and we're fully bought into that. And then for the landlords that work with us in serving our most vulnerable population, we certainly are always seeking ways to support those landlords, whether those are mitigation opportunities or simply the opportunity to know that case management is working with our clients. So I'd ask the council members here today, as the conversation develops, to know that what we're truly seeking is just an opportunity for our clients so that they're not completely biased when they enter into the marketplace just based on the assistance that they need to get back on their feet.
Thank you, Mr. Scalise. Thank you for your comments. And I'll just, what we'll do is go ahead and give everyone, all of our guests, an opportunity to speak, and then we'll open it up for questions to the council. Okay. So that'll be the procedure. I think, Debbie Berry, I think we'll call on you next, and Lauren, if you don't mind, you could be third. Thank you. And welcome, Debbie Berry. I believe you may have been here before.
Yes, I was here a few weeks ago. Thank you, Mr. Chair. After listening to a lot of the comments last week, I just wanted to clarify some things about the Housing Choice Voucher Program to make sure everyone had the knowledge of the guidelines. The landlords and owners would still be able to follow their guidelines that they would normally follow for their unassisted market rate units, such as a credit check, a background check, completing a landlord reference, and they would certainly still be able to reject based on those same guidelines that they're using for their unassisted clients. I also wanted to clarify how the rents were determined. Housing authorities do have to follow what's called a rent reasonableness, and that is to make sure that rents are reasonable in relation to other unassisted housing units in the same market area / census tract with like bedrooms and utilities. We do use a third-party software to conduct that rent reasonableness. With the rent reasonableness is also the payment standard, so it's twofold. The payment standard that Akron currently uses is 100% of the fair market rent. And I believe on the last call, I also mentioned some opportunity zip codes where those payment standards are 110% of the fair market rent. So those are also used as guidelines. And the payment standard is the maximum that AMHA can pay for a family assisted in the voucher program. Now, what happens when the payment standard reaches the rent reasonableness? So the landlord is asking for $1,000 in rent, but the payment standard is $849. So if the rent reasoner would come out okay that they could get the $1,000, the difference between that $849 and $1,000 would have to be made up by the resident. So AMHA does a calculation to make sure the resident has the rent to pay that difference. Just wanted to make sure that does get a little confusing so that you had all the information. And again, with that, the owner and landlord can reject the rent quote if they're not getting what they're asking for.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, one last thing, sorry. I just wanted to go over timelines because timelines seem to be a concern. When the voucher and the request for tenancy approval, which is what the landlord fills out, gets to our offices, we offer the pre-rent quote within 1 to 2 days. If the pre-rent quote is accepted, we go out and conduct an inspection within 10 days. Currently, we are able to get out within 5 days, but our guidelines do allow for 10 days. Then once it passes an inspection, we offer a final rent quote, again, within 1 to 2 days, and then we send the paperwork out to the landlord. Some variables that might be in there is if the paperwork's not filled out correctly, there's no response to calls, or the unit is not ready for inspection, which has happened. The unit must pass with inspection within 30 days. And if a unit would fail the first inspection, once the landlord had the unit ready, we would go out within 5 days for a reinspection.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us again. Thank you. And thank you for that information. Very helpful. Thanks. Okay, Lauren, welcome back.
Hello, thank you all so much for having me again. Just wanted to kind of respond, as some of the others have, around some of the concerns that have been raised as this legislation has been discussed. And I'm going to specifically be focusing on source of income legislation, but happy to talk about pay to stay as well. But just wanted to give you guys a little bit of history and kind of our perspective from the fair housing concerns around this particular protection. Specifically, Fair Housing Contact Service was started 56 years ago because of the fair housing legislation that was passed by Akron City Council in July of 1964. Just as you have been listening and learning these past few weeks through hearings and conversations and data analysis, City Council did then as well. Unfortunately, the real estate interests at that time, led by what was then the Akron Area Board of Realtors, organized a petition campaign for a referendum vote on the legislation, and that ordinance was overturned in the fall of '64. Took a 5-year court battle for that decision of the referendum to be ruled as unconstitutional, and for Akron to really be able to put into place its fair housing laws. I don't want to see Akron take the same path that happened 57 years ago. Fair Housing Contact Service has been working on these pieces of legislation now for multiple years. Got really underway a couple of years ago and wanted to just give some understanding of how source of income is a protection that, even though it's not currently covered, our agency continues to deal with many community members that have experienced a loss of housing opportunity or differential treatment or just blatant discrimination and discriminatory statements because of their source of income and that they're using to pay for their housing needs. It is the mission of our agency to work to eliminate discrimination in our community, and by supporting these legislative changes, we are working to fulfill our mission. And as the Fair Housing Organization for the City of Akron, we continue to urge you to pass this legislation to show how Akron is moving forward with affirmatively furthering fair housing. There are a couple statistics that I want you to all be aware of as well. We really do believe that source of income is oftentimes a proxy for race. And as you heard in many of the voicemails left for council over the past few weeks, housing providers are often saying that they don't want to be, quote, forced to accept, quote, Section 8 because they should be able to select who they want in their property that they own. And they were often commenting about how they do not want to rent to, quote, those people. Statistically, 75% of voucher holders in the city of Akron and 54% of those accessing rental assistance programs like Joe spoke of today are households that identify as Black, even though the Black population of Akron is under 30%. This disparity in program participation results in a more negative impact of source of income discrimination on Black households. As Akron declared racism a public health crisis last year, these pieces of legislation are 2 action steps that the city can take to move forward to stopping this disparate impact in our currently racist housing structure. We believe that there are a number of items of misinformation that have been circulating in regards to source of income. First, it is important to view source of income legislation in the same context that we view any other fair housing protection, whether that be race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, family status, military status, sexual orientation, gender identity, or age, which are all protected in the city of Akron. A landlord's individual screening practices, as have been stated by the other speakers here today, can and should still apply when source of income is being used to pay the rent, whatever type of source of income that may be, whether it's non-traditional sources or not. But for example, a housing provider that's going to run background checks and credit checks and all those things should be doing the same thing, whether the tenant is a private market tenant, or maybe they're using a housing choice voucher or rapid rehousing dollars. If the applicant did not pass that housing provider's screening, the reason for denial is based on the non-discriminatory screening criteria, not solely because of a portion of the rent that that person has is coming from federal funds. So I know that you've received many studies and reviews. I've been the one who sent many of them to you that have come into your email inbox in the past few weeks, and I'm happy to talk to you about them. But I do want to, with the rest of my time here today, share with you a story about a real client that we did change their name, that we've worked with, and whose outcome would be very different if source of income would have been a protected class. Andrea had waited for more than 3 years to come to the top of the waiting list for a housing choice voucher. She knew this program was what she needed to move into housing that would meet the needs for her 3 children. At the time that she had come to the top of the waiting list for the voucher program, she had been staying in a local domestic violence shelter after escaping an abusive relationship, and she had been there already for a number of months. Andrea began looking for housing as soon as she received her voucher and the necessary paperwork from AMHA, but she really just struggled to find a unit. She frequently told my staff that she was either told a unit wasn't available or frequently just told, no, we don't accept Section 8. And so Andrea was forced to remain in the shelter for 4 more months than necessary because of those denials. And she ultimately lost her job because of how much time she had to spend searching for housing. As Andrea was getting close to the end of her 20-day time limit, because someone can only have a voucher for 120 days, as she was getting close to that end of that 120-day time limit, her only options became take whatever place would take her voucher or give up that precious resource of a housing choice voucher. If source of income protections existed, the housing providers who told Andrea no automatically may have actually assessed Andrea in the same process they would for other applicants. And Andrea's denial from dozens of housing opportunities resulted in her having to stay in shelter and use those precious shelter resources for her when somebody else could have needed and used those resources. And also that meant continuing her family and her children being homeless for that additional time. We believe housing is a social determinant of all, and I'm sure you've all have heard me say that for many times now, but it's true. Where you live determines your access to schools, to medical care, to jobs, to healthy food, parks and recreation. Everything in your life surrounded by where you live. And if a family is unable to obtain affordable housing of their choice, we as a community have a duty to assess our current structure to understand why and make the necessary changes to ensure this social determinant is met. I believe Akron has moved forward in the last 57 years since our earlier fair housing ordinance. And I do not want to see history repeat itself for our current fair housing measure. The real estate interests were on the wrong side of the law and the wrong side of history in 1964, and I believe they are today in 2021. Please don't let today's vote in City Council fall on the wrong side the way that it did, and support this legislation as much as you possibly can. It was what our agency really believes needs to happen to make our community a better place. Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. President Somerville, did you have any comments at this time?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I want to first just thank you, Councilman Fusco, for chairing these conversations. I think the conversations have been extremely helpful. Again, wanting to make sure that we hear from all sides. So I just want to thank you for your leadership on this. And I want to thank the agencies that have come before today just to share a little bit more information with us. On council, we hear about equity on council. We hear about equity. And I think this is what this piece really is, not to overcomplicate it, right? But instead of us talking about equity, this is a step, an opportunity for City Council, the city of Akron, to move us towards having housing equity in the city of Akron. Again, a step towards having housing equality in the city of Akron. The thing about it is that in order for us to achieve housing equality in the city of Akron, we cannot do it alone, the city. We can't do it by ourselves, right? So there has to be a partnership with our landlords, with our housing providers. We need their help. And so this is not a piece of legislation that's trying to force landlords or property owners to accept vouchers, but it is an ask. We are asking, when you do your screening process and you are trying to find the best tenant, that maybe you just take a little bit more time, be willing to have a conversation with someone, even though they have a voucher. We have to move towards this away from this whole concept of your money is not good here. We know that discrimination exists. You know, data does not lie. And so we have a responsibility to do our part to make sure that housing equality happens in the city of Akron and that everybody can apply, right? Everybody can apply, not just certain people, but everybody, even those who have a voucher, should be able to apply. And that's what this piece speaks to. And so again, I think we've had great conversation, and I think this is just it. You know, we have to keep the conversation going. We know that policy is broken. We know that processes, you know, aren't perfect. And I think Councilman Neal mentioned this, but Mayor Horgan is willing and has committed to create a landlord tenant council. So that's the vehicle that we get there so that we can continue to have these conversations. You know, we've heard concerns from landlords, and I think we need to address some of those concerns. We need to talk about some of those concerns. But again, this is just the start. But this is just our step, a way for the city of Akron to be a leader so that we can make sure that everybody has access to safe, affordable housing in Akron.
Thank you, President Somerville. Next, I'd like to see Linda Mobian has her hand up. Ms. Mobian?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm certainly opposed to any kind of discrimination of any kind. Here's what I want to know. I work with individuals who are underserved, homeless, who live on Section 8 and vouchers and things. Do we have in the city of Akron a cadre of landlords who are willing to work with us and offer housing to individuals? Because what I'm thinking is, and I hear people talk about, and I heard Mr. Scalise talk about case management, and case management is only going to do so much. Do we, because I know that from the outset, we can all assume that when they hear the word voucher or Section 8, they think of a certain kind of person who doesn't take care of the property, with children that are running, wild and just not living up to whatever standard that they think of. But if we have a cadre of landlords who is saying, I have housing in different parts of the city, different parts of the county, I'm willing to house individuals with these vouchers. And I am willing to work with the case managers or whomever to help these individuals stay in their housing units. Because I think what happens is when people get into some of these places, they have these inspections and folks don't pass the inspections. And folks have damage to their properties. And I know you don't have to be a voucher holder to damage somebody's property. But I can only imagine that when they start thinking about and talking about, they kind of pigeonhole individuals. And I want landlords to recognize that it is a privilege to be a business provider in this city. And people may not think of that, but it is a privilege for them to be able to provide a service. And as such, we certainly want them to offer it to any and everybody. I just don't want folks going into a place where, quote, they're not wanted and they're not going to be treated well. So if we have a cadre of landlords that are saying, I'll step up and here's what I'm willing to do if you're willing to do your part. Because I think we just need to recognize that we may not ever know all of the reasons that people are going to give, and they may be legitimate reasons why they won't house somebody. And I'm not really sure how much teeth is in this, that we're going to force the issue when we suspect that with everything being equal, we believe that you're refusing this person because they have a housing voucher. So we're going to file discriminatory action against you. I don't know how much of that we're going to do, or how much, interest people have in that. Because if we're going to do this and force the issue, it's going to come down to some of that. And I, for one, if we can find some landlords that are saying, I'm willing to do this, work with you, I would love for them to be willing participants. And that's just my spiel. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Mobian. Very good. Next, I'm not sure of the order, but I think Mr. Neal, then Mr. Malik, and then Mr. Freeman.
Actually, sir, it was Mr. Malik first.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Malik.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Neal. I just, I'm struck sitting here. We've heard from the last month from Lauren Greenhall from Fair Housing. That was very powerful testimony, as it has been in previous weeks, about how related this is to racial disparities and racial discrimination, right? That discrimination on the basis of housing, on the basis of source of income, is often a pretext for discrimination on the basis of race, right? We've heard from folks at AMHA, including Ms. Berry and Mr. Gage, about their efforts to make the system as streamlined as possible and to reduce some of the myths that are out there. But we've heard from a lot of housing providers who don't want to participate in the housing choice voucher program, who would rather just not get involved in it. But Ms. Mobian made a wonderful point when she pointed out that being a housing provider, operating that business, comes with certain obligations. When you operate any business, it comes with certain obligations, and government can make some of those business regulations. This is one of those business regulations. It's not the only one we have for housing, but it would be a new one. But it's totally reasonable when you have a situation where voucher holders are clustered in certain neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, and they're not able to get housing in a ward or an area that might have a little bit less poverty because folks are discriminating against them. And I thought the most insightful thing that I've heard today, with respect to everyone else, came from Mr. Scalise. Mr. Scalise is trying to house 91 people, and he's not doing it with respect to the voucher program. He's not doing it through the voucher program. He's doing it through United Way and through the funds that they have. And so all of the folks he's talking about, they don't have the strings attached of the housing choice voucher program. And he's saying he cannot get those folks placed. Those folks have guaranteed rent through United Way. Those folks have case management, and yet he cannot get those folks placed. And it sounds like that really gives lie to some of the concern that folks say, my concern is the administrative burden. I'm sure for some folks it is, but for a lot of folks, it is a pretext for not wanting those people to be in a certain neighborhood. And that's the point that President Somerville made. It's a point that many folks have made. It's a point that we heard about from the expert, Mr. Lepley from Cuyahoga County. It's the reason why I think all of us, if we're committed to equity, should support this. So I would like to hopefully be added as a co-sponsor as well, but I hope we can vote to approve this next week.
Thank you, Mr. Malik, for your comments. Mr. Neal, I had you next. Do you want me to wait or?
Oh, no, I'm good, sir.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Again, appreciate the dialogue. That's the beauty of the country that we live in. We get to work these things out. I would like for us to keep one thing in mind. We did hear from several housing providers that said they don't have a problem with the voucher. They had concerns with AMHA. And I think that this is a good opportunity for us to, as we look at a tenant landlord, those that are part of the housing providing industry, AMHA being a close partner with that group. Because, many of them talked about how if they miss a inspection, if they fail, how they lose that month's rent, how their rent is abated. And it makes me kind of think of the tenant. The tenant lives in the apartment for a month, 2 months, whatever they're behind. And when they bring the money, we want them to be made whole. I agree with that. I agree with that. And I think it's one time. I think it may want to look at forming how to work with those landlords who do everything they can, not those that are trying to cut corners, but you provided that housing for that month or for that time period and for it to be abated. That's what the landlords were talking about as far as a challenge with AMHA. And I think that right there would be one thing to work with within that group. The other thing, I do think it is important to, and this isn't about discriminating, but as one whose ward was impacted by not being intentional about how the number of homes that were AMHA voucher homes and the number of, this goes with group homes as well. I think this gives us an opportunity to look at how, when we do not monitor our neighborhoods, just like, I've raised issues about the one piece of ordinance that was passed in the West End that said if a house sat too long, it reverted back to a single family. And we know that was challenging because there were some homes that were built as 3 units or 2 units originally, but based on that ordinance, they wanted them switched to single family. So, Mr. Chairman, what I'm saying is this is an opportunity for us to look at how housing is, our ordinances, and how by being the different impacts of group homes, vouchers, unmonitored impacts on our community, where we can look to change those. And I can say this because I don't think anybody's gonna, if they want to call me, say my comment is racist or classist or whatever, I'm willing to stand behind what I'm saying. But I have seen when we weren't intentional and we moved people from different communities and did not provide the structure, how it's impacted neighborhoods. It impacted parts of West Akron. It impacted parts of Northwest Akron. And we can't deny that we need to be partners with. It's not just about the money. It's about making sure that we provide quality matriculation into neighborhoods, and that we support not just the tenant, not just the landlord, but that community as a whole. So thanks for letting me be long-winded. Hopefully my points are understood. If not, I'll be happy to explain them to anyone. But I'm saying that since this door is open, I'd like for us to walk all the way through it and address all these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. Mr. Freeman?
Yes, thank you. Probably a question for Lauren, Ellen, and Miss Berry as well. First of all, Lauren, the story that you gave us about the lady that could not find housing, what was it that the housing just wasn't available, that no one would open up to her? Or were there some properties that she just said, no, I don't want to be in this neighborhood? Can you clarify on that for me?
Yeah, on that particular example that I provided, it was just a significant amount of denial that she was getting at that point. She was looking, especially when she first started looking, for a specific neighborhood because one of her children had some special needs and needed some special school accommodations. But once she got so many denials from that community, she just opened up her search and was still just getting a significant amount of denials. I don't remember, we had asked AMHA previously how many vouchers don't end up being used, and I don't know that Debbie has access to that data point immediately, but I can look it up if folks are really interested. But there is a number of vouchers that are issued to individuals and they can never use them because they can never find the housing. So they lose that opportunity at that point in time. It's not as high in Summit County because we do have some resources to help folks with their search, but it, as it is in some other counties, but it is something that does significantly happen in our community.
Okay, thank you. And then Ellen, I was wondering, you know, if we would pass this and it would move in, you know, we're hoping it wouldn't, but it would move into the area of, you know, there's some punitive things that happen to a landlord here. Will any of that be established, you know, fines or whatever might happen before we pass the legislation?
So can I answer, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, oh, yes, thank you.
So I think there's been a little bit of confusion in the way this has been conceptualized. This is not a criminal penalty, right? Some states and cities do develop it that way. There's not a set fine and a penalty for violating this ordinance. You're not committing a crime. What you're doing is discriminating, which violates our code. So the remedy is really more civil in that sense. It's to make the person who was injured the victim of a discrimination whole. So there can't be a set number put on that. Again, it's going to be very fact determinative. So what actually happened in that situation to that prospective tenant based on that landlord's discrimination. So I'm not sure if that helps answer the question, but it's not a criminal penalty that would have a specific dollar amount assigned to it.
Okay, so then it would be, I mean, if that happened to somebody, it would be incumbent upon the individual that had experienced the discrimination to file with Fair Housing, or who?
So they would file with the Akron Civil Rights Commission, and Lauren could speak more to this, but I believe Fair Housing would help in an advocacy role. If there was an individual who approached them and said they believe they were discriminated against, Fair Housing could be an advocate for them in the Akron Civil Rights Commission forum. So yes, the alleged victim would file with the Akron Civil Rights Commission, and then it would go through the process that is already established. Again, our Akron Civil Rights Commission hears complaints now every month based on discrimination, whether it's race or, again, all the factors that Lauren mentioned. And they have a process that involves initially giving an opportunity for mediation and for that landlord to be educated. Maybe they weren't aware of this law. They hadn't heard of all the great conversations you guys have been having over the last month. So they can possibly just make it right with that tenant. Or if they're not willing to do that, there's further steps in the process that would involve a hearing. And again, there would be evidence, an opportunity for both sides to present their case, and ultimately the commission would issue a decision.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. Then one final question, if I may, and this would be for Ms. Berry. Have you anticipated, you know, if we would pass this, have you anticipated a substantial increase in perhaps inspections that you're going to have to make?
I think we would probably have a little bit of an increase. To answer Lauren's question before that goes along with your inspection is we have an 80% success rate on our vouchers. So for every 100 vouchers that are out there, 80 of them find housing. So there would be more inspections based off of that. So hopefully we can get that 80% closer to the 100%. And right now, I think I mentioned that our turnaround time is 5 days, and we are allowed up to 10 days. So we are prepared and hope that we do have some more inspections so that we can utilize more of our vouchers and house more people, and not only house more people, but house them quicker. The other thing I did want to clarify is someone had mentioned if that a unit fails inspection, they get abated. Once the landlord fails an inspection for the first time, a second inspection is completed approximately 25 to 30 days after that the first inspection. And at that point in time is when the abatement happens. It never happens at the first inspection. There's always ample opportunity to get the items repaired.
Okay. Thanks to all of you. That's all the questions I had. Thank you, Mr. Fusco.
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I do have a question for Debbie Berry. This came in, and I may get an email about this as well, but just for the information for the committee and everyone. So, and you had alluded to this earlier, that if, you know, there's a base rent, I guess, that's, and I'm probably using the wrong terminology, so forgive me, but like a rent that's established for an area, but then again, the landlord believes that, you know, it should be X. We'll just use example, like, you know, $800. The landlord says $1,000, just for an example. So there's a $200 difference gap, if you will. And so with that gap, the tenant would be responsible. Is that correct? For the difference, if I understood that correctly.
As long as it meets the rent reasoner. If the rent meets the rent reasoner, then the difference between the payment standard and that higher portion of rent would go towards the resident. And again, we do have to do a calculation, because when they move in, their rent is typically at 30% of their adjusted gross income. And at move-in, it can go up to 40% of the adjusted gross income. So we do a calculation based on their income as to what they can pay. After they've lived at the property a year, that 40% can go upwards to, there's no cap on it at that point in time. Certainly, we don't want the cap too high for the resident to be able to afford it. But at move-in, they can pay up to 40% of their income. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you for clarifying that. That coupled with the next piece of the question, I guess, would be is the timing. So I don't know if they mesh in terms of, you know, what is received from the from MHA, and then what's received, you know, whatever the dollar amount is that's received from the tenant itself, if there's a difference between the two or not. And I'm getting to something here, and that is that if obviously the rent is guaranteed from AMHA and from the voucher, it's guaranteed. But if there's not a payment from the tenant that is in between that market that's decided and the actual amount that's received from the tenant, and it's not received to the landlord, how is that handled? How's that handled? That's the question that was posed to me, so I'm just passing it on.
If there was non-payment of rent for the voucher participants portion, they would handle it just like they would any other unassisted housing and pursue legal action.
Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. If there's no other questions, I want to thank everybody for the dialogue. Like I said from the beginning, you know, I just appreciate that we're having these exchanges of thoughts and learning exactly what it is that we're dealing with here. I appreciate all the discourse back and forth, and I appreciate the time that's been taken, all of our guests, not only today, but over the past several weeks, and the discussion that's occurred, and want to thank everybody for all that. And with that, I will entertain a motion that we adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it. Thank you all very much. Thank you again for joining us today. Thanks.
That is the end of the committee meetings for the day. Council will meet at 7 p.m. tonight. Thank you.